Deep in the Bavarian Alps, nestled among snow-covered peaks, stood the Berghütte Felsenblick, a remote mountain lodge with a chilling reputation. Locals whispered of a ghostly woman who appeared at windows during snowstorms, her face pale and sorrowful, as if trapped between the living and the dead. Few dared to visit the lodge, but for a group of adventurous hikers, the legends were nothing more than tales to scare tourists. Max, Lena, Stefan, and Annika were experienced hikers who had planned their winter trek months in advance. When a sudden blizzard rolled in, they had no choice but to abandon their route and seek shelter. Guided by a crude map and fading daylight, they stumbled upon Felsenblick, its dark silhouette barely visible through the swirling snow. The lodge appeared abandoned, its wooden beams worn and its shutters rattling in the wind. Inside, the air was cold, but the hikers were relieved to find a fireplace, some old furniture, and enough firewood to keep warm. They settled in, joking about the eerie atmosphere, though Lena seemed uneasy. "I've heard of this place," she murmured. "They say it's haunted." "By who? Krampus?" Max laughed, brushing off her concerns. As the snowstorm intensified, the hikers felt the lodge's oppressive silence settle over them. Late that night, Annika thought she saw something in the window, a fleeting shadow against the howling white. She dismissed it as a trick of the storm, but the next morning she found frozen handprints on the glass. "Who could have been outside in that weather?" Stefan asked, his voice uneasy. No one had an answer. As the day wore on, the group grew more tense. Max, the skeptic, began hearing faint tapping on the windows, though every time he checked, nothing was there. Lena claimed she saw a face staring back at her, pale and mournful, but it disappeared when she blinked. Desperate for answers, Lena explored the lodge's small library, eventually finding an old journal hidden behind a loose plank. The entries told the story of Katharina Weiss, the wife of the lodge's first owner. Trapped in a snowstorm decades ago, she had waited by the window for her husband to return from town with supplies. He never made it, and Katharina, driven mad with grief, froze to death in the lodge. "She's still waiting," Lena whispered, trembling. "That's why she looks into the windows. She's searching for him." That evening, the storm reached its peak. The wind screamed around the lodge, and the windows frosted over completely. As the group huddled by the fire, Max decided to prove there was nothing to fear. "I'm going outside," he declared. "There's no ghost, just a creepy story." The others begged him not to go, but Max laughed off their concerns. He opened the door and disappeared into the white abyss. Hours passed, and Max didn't return. By morning, the storm had cleared, leaving an eerie stillness. The group searched the lodge's perimeter but found no trace of Max, only a single set of frozen footprints leading to the woods, which abruptly stopped. As they prepared to leave, shaken and grief-stricken, Stefan noticed something chilling. Every window in the lodge, inside and out, was marked by frozen handprints. No matter how much they wiped the glass, the prints reappeared, as though someone or something was watching. The group fled, abandoning their gear and making their way back to the village below. When they told their story, the locals shook their heads knowingly. "Felsenblick," one elder said, "claims its visitors. Katharina isn't done searching." Months later, a rescue team found Max's pack in the woods near the lodge. Inside was a photo of the group, taken just before their hike. Strangely, a pale woman stood behind them in the reflection of a window, her face pressed against the glass.
Late one evening, Ella boarded the last train home after a grueling day at work. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few scattered figures. A businessman sat with his briefcase clutched tightly, a young woman held a book, and a mother cradled a child with a teddy bear. Ella barely noticed them as she took her seat near the middle of the car, letting out a sigh of relief. The train doors hissed shut, and with a jolt, the train began its journey. Ella stared out the window, watching the dim city lights blur past. She tried to distract herself with her phone, but there was no signal, and the battery quickly died. Frustrated, she tucked it into her bag and leaned back, letting the soothing clatter of the train lull her into a daze. Minutes passed before Ella noticed something odd. The train was unusually quiet. No chatter, no rustling of newspapers, not even the sound of breathing. Glancing around, she realized that none of the other passengers were moving. The businessman sat rigid, his hands frozen mid-air as if caught in the act of adjusting his briefcase. The young woman's book was open on her lap, but she hadn't turned a page. The mother's hand rested on her child's head, both of them motionless, their gazes fixed forward. Ella shifted uncomfortably, her unease growing. "Hello," she called softly, her voice echoing unnaturally in the silent car. No one responded. She stood, walking toward the nearest passenger, the young woman with the book. "Excuse me, are you okay?" Ella asked, lightly touching her shoulder. The woman's head turned sharply toward Ella, but her eyes didn't meet hers. Instead, they stared blankly past her, wide and lifeless. Ella stumbled back with a gasp, her heart pounding. Ella retreated to her seat, trying to make sense of what was happening. Her thoughts were interrupted by the train slowing down. She peered out the window and saw a dimly lit station coming into view. The sign above the platform read, "Grimwood Halt." She had never heard of this station before, and it didn't appear on the train's usual route. The platform was decrepit, overgrown with moss and weeds, and the few flickering lights barely illuminated the crumbling walls. The train stopped with a groan, and the doors slid open. Ella looked around at the other passengers. None of them moved. The stillness was suffocating. Ella hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay seated, but something about the station pulled at her. She gathered her bag and stood, her eyes darting nervously between the motionless passengers. As she stepped toward the door, the businessman suddenly moved, his head snapping up to look at her. "Don't go," he rasped, his voice dry and brittle, like leaves crumbling in the wind. Ella froze in place, her breath hitching. One by one, the other passengers turned to look at her, their unblinking eyes filled with something she couldn't name, something dark, something ancient. Ignoring their silent stares, Ella bolted out onto the platform. The air outside was cold and damp, carrying a faint smell of decay. Ella looked around for an exit, but the platform seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. She heard the train doors close behind her and turned to see it pulling away, the passengers still watching her as it disappeared into the night. Ella's relief was short-lived. A faint shuffling sound came from behind her. She turned and saw shadows moving among the pillars of the station. The passengers were there, emerging from the darkness one by one, their movements jerky and unnatural. Panic surged through her as she ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty station. She darted down a staircase hoping to find an exit, but it led to a maze of tunnels, their walls cracked and lined with mold. The shuffling grew louder, closer. "Leave me alone," she screamed, but the only response was a low, guttural whisper. "You don't belong here." Ella stumbled into a large chamber where an old, cracked mirror stood propped against the wall. Catching her breath, she turned to face her pursuers. They stood at the entrance, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. In the mirror's reflection, Ella saw something even more horrifying. The passengers appeared as shadowy, skeletal figures with glowing eyes. Worse, she saw her own reflection. Her face was starting to fade, her features becoming translucent. "No," she whispered, backing away. A shadowed hand reached out from the mirror toward her. The passengers stepped closer, their whispers growing louder. "Join us? You can't leave." Ella turned and ran, her feet barely carrying her as the shadows closed in. Ella's eyes snapped open. She was back in her seat on the train. Her heart raced as she looked around. The passengers were no longer frozen. They were smiling at her, wide, lifeless grins that sent chills down her spine. The train rumbled on through an endless expanse of darkness, no stations in sight. Ella tried to move but found herself paralyzed. Her body wouldn't respond, and her voice was gone. Her gaze drifted to the window, where her reflection stared back at her. But it wasn't her. The reflection's eyes were empty, its mouth curling into the same grotesque smile as the other passengers. The silent train had claimed her. Ella realized with dawning horror that she would never reach her destination, and that she was no longer a passenger. She was part of the train now, doomed to haunt its endless journey forever.
The Silver Pines Hotel stood on the outskirts of town, its fading elegance a reminder of its heyday in the 1960s. Now it was just a stopover for weary travelers and a source of eerie local tales. The most unsettling of these stories centered on room 305, a room that had been locked and unused for years. Guests avoided it, and staff spoke of it only in whispers. Sophia, a college student working the night shift at the front desk, had heard the rumors but brushed them off as silly stories. One quiet evening, as the clock struck midnight, the phone rang. She glanced at the screen and froze. Room 305 was calling. "That's not possible," she muttered, her hand trembling as she answered. "Hello?" she said cautiously. A faint, trembling voice whispered, "Help me, please, he's coming." The line went dead before Sophia could respond. Her heart pounded. She checked the booking system, but room 305 was unoccupied, just as it had been for years. Dismissing it as a prank, she tried to shake the unease. The next day, Sophia mentioned the call to Eva, a senior housekeeper. Eva paled and crossed herself. "You shouldn't answer calls from that room," she warned. Years ago, a woman named Clara stayed there. She was running from someone, her boyfriend, they said. She made frantic calls to the front desk that night, begging for help, but no one came in time. They found her the next morning, strangled to death. Her killer was never caught. Sophia laughed nervously, but the memory of the whispering voice sent chills down her spine. The following night, the phone rang again. Room 305. This time, the voice was more desperate. "He's here, help me." Sophia tried to respond, but the only reply was the sound of faint tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. She mustered her courage and checked the hallway leading to room 305. It was empty, the air cold and still. The door to 305 was locked tight, and through the peephole, she saw only darkness. Over the next few nights, the calls grew more frequent, the voice more frantic. "He's in the room," the woman cried one night. "Don't let him find me." Determined to uncover the truth, Sophia searched online archives and found articles about Clara's murder. The details were harrowing. Clara had called the front desk several times, pleading for help as her abusive ex-boyfriend broke into her room. By the time staff arrived, she was gone, her body later discovered in a nearby alley. The room had been locked ever since. Sophia became obsessed with the case, convinced Clara's spirit was trying to communicate with her. But one night, the calls took a sinister turn. This time, it wasn't Clara's voice. A deep, guttural tone growled, "Stay out of this." The lights in the lobby flickered, and a shadowy figure appeared at the end of the hall, motionless and menacing. Sophia locked herself in the office, shaking. When she emerged at dawn, room 305's door was ajar. Inside, the room was trashed, and on the cracked mirror above the dresser, a message was scrawled in red. "She'll never escape." Sophia quit the job the next day, but her nightmares didn't end. Weeks later, she began receiving calls late at night from an unknown number. When she picked up, she could hear the faint sound of tapping, followed by Clara's desperate voice. "Help me. He's coming." Room 305 remains locked to this day, its tragic story a haunting reminder of a desperate cry for help that came too late. The Silver Pines Hotel stands as a beacon for the restless, forever echoing Clara's last call.
When newlyweds Alice and Mark stumbled upon the dilapidated Victorian house at the edge of town, they couldn't believe their luck. The price was suspiciously low, but the realtor assured them it was simply due to the house's age and disrepair. The couple saw potential in the creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, imagining it as the perfect project to turn into their dream home. Moving in was uneventful, though Alice couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't until the third day of unpacking that they discovered the locked door in the attic. The couple was confused. Neither the realtor nor the property inspection had mentioned a room up there. The brass handle was tarnished, and despite their efforts, it wouldn't budge. "Probably just a storage space," Mark suggested, brushing it off. But Alice's curiosity grew. That night, as the wind howled through the old house, she swore she heard faint scratching and a soft, almost imperceptible hum from above. Over the next week, the noises persisted, growing louder each night. The scratching was joined by rhythmic tapping, like tiny fingers drumming on the floorboards. Mark dismissed it as the house settling, or a raccoon trapped in the attic. But Alice wasn't convinced. She began avoiding the attic entirely during the day, the locked door filling her with unease. One night, unable to sleep, she ventured upstairs. The door was silent, but as she leaned closer, she heard a faint sound. A baby's cry, soft and muffled, as if it were coming from far away. Her heart raced as she stumbled back down the stairs, locking herself in the bedroom. "Mark, there's something wrong with that room," she whispered urgently the next morning. Mark finally agreed to investigate. Armed with a crowbar, he pried the door open. The wood groaned as the lock gave way, revealing a small, dust-filled nursery. The air inside was icy, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. The room was a relic of another era: faded wallpaper with pastel patterns, a rocking chair in the corner, and an old crib covered in cobwebs. On the wall was a framed photograph of a smiling woman holding a baby, her eyes unnervingly intense. After opening the room, the noises escalated. The scratching was no longer confined to the attic. It seemed to follow Alice throughout the house. Lights flickered, and objects moved on their own. One morning, Alice found the rocking chair swaying back and forth, though the windows were closed and there was no breeze. The photograph began appearing in random places around the house. No matter where they put it, they'd find it later on the kitchen counter, their nightstand, or propped against the mirror in the bathroom. Alice started having vivid nightmares of the woman in the photograph. She dreamed of her walking through the house, searching for something or someone. In one particularly vivid nightmare, Alice saw the woman standing at the foot of their bed, her face twisted with rage as she whispered, "Bring him back." Desperate for answers, Alice visited the town archives. What she uncovered sent chills down her spine. The house had belonged to the Blackwood family in the 1920s. The couple, Margaret and Samuel, had a son named Henry, who tragically died in infancy. Margaret, consumed by grief, locked herself in the nursery and refused to leave. Neighbors reported hearing her singing lullabies to her dead child late into the night. Eventually, Margaret died in the same room, her body discovered weeks later, clutching the baby's blanket. Alice returned home with the horrifying realization that Margaret's spirit was still in the house, searching for her child. That night, the activity reached a fever pitch. Doors slammed, the baby's cries echoed through the halls, and the photograph flew across the room, shattering into pieces. Mark, skeptical until now, was terrified. "We need to leave," he shouted, grabbing Alice's arm. But Alice froze. She felt an overwhelming sorrow, as though someone were pleading with her to stay. Against her better judgment, she walked to the nursery. Inside, the rocking chair moved violently, as if an unseen force were pushing it. "What do you want?" Alice whispered, tears streaming down her face. The temperature dropped, and for a moment she saw her breath fogging the air. Then she heard it, a soft, broken voice whispering, "My baby." Alice suddenly understood. She rummaged through the attic and found an old, tattered doll, likely Henry's. She placed it gently in the crib and whispered, "Here's your baby. You can rest now." The house grew still. The oppressive heaviness lifted, and for the first time in weeks, the couple felt at peace. Alice and Mark decided to sell the house shortly after, unable to shake the eerie memories. But as they packed their belongings, Alice found one final surprise. The photograph of Margaret and her baby, now free of dust and damage. In the corner, someone had scrawled the words, "Thank you."